Yeah.
Good afternoon. It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mark Fischetti. Mark is the editor in charge of environment and energy coverage at Scientific American. He was the managing director of the magazine's Earth 3.0 special editions and helped launch Scientific American Mind. His Scientific American article, 2001, Drowning New Orleans, many of you know about that, predicted the widespread disaster that a storm like Hurricane Katrina can actually impose. He co-wrote Weaving the Web with Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the WWW, which reveals how the web was really created. It's a terrific read. If you haven't done so, please read that. He also co-wrote The New Killer Diseases with microbiologist Eleanor Levy. He has a physics degree and has twice served as the Atway Fellow in Civic Culture at the Centenary College of Louisiana, which has awarded him an honorary doctorate as well. He has been a freelance writer for the New York Times, the Smithsonian, Fast Company, and many others. He has also been a frequent broadcaster and been at CNN, the History Channel, NPR News, and also NBC's Meet the Press. Mark is going to talk to us about the energy industry's media triumphs and disasters. So please join me in welcoming Mark.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Great. So thanks for being here. I wanted to start with a little video. You can just look at it and imagine all that stuff on the right side there spewing out, spewing out, spewing out, spewing out. And I wanted to ask you to think about what your reaction is. Is it pride? Hopefulness? Recognition?
We've done this in the Gulf of Mexico before.
Yes. So, right. So something probably more like despair or maybe anger or maybe even embarrassment, perhaps, for the people involved. So that was the Deepwater Horizon spill from April 20th, 2010. And every day, day after day, for 87 days, anytime you turned on the news, you saw this video. So the accident was a personal disaster for the 11 workers on that platform, of course, and it was an environmental disaster, but it was also a public relations disaster for BP. And in the first few days, BP kind of set up a dynamic with the media that I think in the end made the fallout from this whole situation a lot worse than it needed to be for them. And at first they avoided questions, and then they kind of lowballed the estimates, saying sort of anonymously that somehow it was 5,000 barrels a day that was leaking out of this pipe. But the estimates were so low that scientists who had been seeing that video day after day knew right away that that estimate was off. And so what happened was scientists started to speak out saying this volume can't be correct, and that fueled speculation. And then we heard numbers like 50,000 barrels a day or 100,000 barrels a day. And the speculation continued, and BP didn't give its own data to correct that. And months later, it was determined the rate probably was more like 50,000 barrels a day when at its peak rate. But by being tight-lipped, BP allowed speculation to take over. And every news outlet that was interviewing the scientists was trying to get a number. Meanwhile, the CEO of BP, Tony Hayes, made this sort of dismissive statement saying that the oil leak was this tiny compared with the volume of the Gulf of Mexico. Well, perhaps. It's kind of a big volume of water. And all the while, tar balls were washing up on the coast, and there were cleanup crews, and BP was kind of absent from all of this. And throughout the whole affair, again, this dynamic created a situation that didn't need to be created. And it set up the media to distrust British Petroleum, and this sort of condescending demeanor that they took made the situation worse. So anyone at a company or university who wants to learn the best way to handle a crisis should study how the pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson handled the so-called Tylenol case. Some of you are old enough to remember. Some of you may not be. But this turned out to be a Harvard Business Review case study of this disaster that I'll describe in a second. And that case study is actually, to this day, one of the Harvard Business Review's own designated 10 best articles of all time that they've done. So what happened was in October of 1982, 7 people suddenly died after taking extra strength Tylenol. And it became apparent that some unknown person had literally taken bottles off the shelf, put cyanide in the bottles, put some bottles back on the shelves, and people bought them, took the pills, and 7 people died. So immediately, this paranoia swept across the country. Tylenol had accounted for 37% of all the painkillers sold, and immediately that share dropped to 7%. So it's big news. And what did Johnson & Johnson do? It immediately pulled 31 million bottles of pills off the shelves at a cost to them of $100 million in 1982. And even though Johnson & Johnson was not responsible for what happened, they took responsibility for what was going on. So no new Tylenol went back on the shelves until they created this triple seal tamper-proof packaging, which was the first such packaging in the country. And so the legacy of this is today, all those bottles that we get that we kind of struggle with opening, it's all stemmed from this case. And there was a kind of concurrent regulatory environment that said now, any kind of pharmaceutical products need to have these kinds of containers. So Johnson & Johnson jumped out ahead of what even was required to do. And they also sent about 2,000 of their media people and salespeople out to talk to doctors, medical communities, hospitals, and the media to restore confidence in their product and how they were handling the potential contamination of future products. So a year later, Tylenol sales were almost back to where they had been, which for this kind of situation is pretty remarkable. So what's the contrast here? Sorry, this isn't an energy example, but it'll feed into that. What's the contrast between what BP did and what Johnson & Johnson did? So very recently, a person named Chris Malone is at this Relational Capital Group, which is kind of a brand advisory company. They kind of he summed up nicely what the media and the public, why the media and public kind of gave Johnson & Johnson a pass and why they didn't give British Petroleum a pass. So I just want to tell you what he said. He said, consumers instinctively judge companies much in the same way as they judge other people. Humans have this keen ability to judge other people in terms of their intentions and their ability to carry out those intentions. And that includes trustworthiness and selflessness. And Johnson & Johnson kind of aced that, and British Petroleum kind of flunked that. So he went on to say, insincere attempts to create the perception of trustworthiness won't work. Right? We all say this colloquially. We all think we have a good bullshit indicator, right? That's what he's saying. Instead, companies just have to exhibit honest intentions, no matter what the cost in the short term. And so instead of taking selfless actions like shutting down and inspecting all of its deep water wells, or appointing an outsider of unquestionable integrity to undertake an investigation, British Petroleum just behaved in the way that a lot of us kind of recoil from. So, I want to emphasize that, reporters, writers, and editors were humans like everybody else, honestly. So we're not immune from this same kind of reaction, no matter how objective we want to try to be. So it's instructive to look at these disasters because they kind of put these issues in high relief. So now I want, again, for you to think about your reactions when you see this next set of images. So what are we looking at? Fukushima, right. So how do you feel now when you see these? Are you feeling despair or anger or embarrassment? Probably not. I mean, you might feel some despair for Japan's people. You might feel some despair for the utility workers who had to sort of try to fight these fires under these ridiculous conditions. But how do you feel about the nuclear industry? In particular, how do you feel about the US nuclear industry? Most Americans don't feel that same gut negative reaction that they do feel when they see the BP video. So why is that? Well, I mean, admittedly, Fukushima was far away, right? So that might have something to do with it. But you know, it was far away from Germany too. And what happened in the weeks after the accident in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel's government basically said, you know, we're shutting down the nuclear power industry in Germany. So that could have happened here. I mean, there's 104 operating reactors in the United States, right? They're all over the country. Americans could have risen up and said, hey, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We don't want this industry anymore. Look what happened in Japan. But I think the leaders of the US nuclear industry and of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for that matter, I think they might have read the Tylenol case study, because they didn't downplay the implications. They didn't say, oh, US reactors are safer, you know, we know how to operate these better. Instead, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission immediately said it would examine every single reactor in the United States. And all the utility companies operating those reactors agreed. I mean, they agreed to be investigated. And fairly quickly, the NRC issued several orders for new safety equipment and additional steps beyond that for reactors that had the same containment vessel designs as the ones in Japan did. And all along the way, the Regulatory Commission and the utilities were telling the media what was going on, without attitudes, without sort of preconceived trying to control the information. They were just conveying what was happening in a simple, honest way. And in addition to sort of freely complying and talking to the press, they actually talked about future designs that were supposedly safer. And they talked to certain reporters in pretty much in detail about even some criticisms of these future designs. And one of those reporters was Adam Puri, who did an in-depth piece for us, Scientific American, on this very topic. I was Adam's editor for the story. And I can tell you that even though the nuclear industry has not always been forthcoming, it talked pretty frankly with Adam about potential safety problems with current and future reactors, to the point where they sent us technical illustrations about the reactor designs. This is just some of it. You don't have to know the diagrams, but just to show that they were being pretty specific. So instead of breeding mistrust by coming across as evasive or arrogant, the US nuclear industry bred some honest interest in what it was doing and was being forthright about what it was doing. So these kinds of articles that we did and others did presented a much more sort of level-headed debate and even included sort of hopeful signs of progress. And I really think that approach helped save the future of the US nuclear industry. You know, at the time of Fukushima, there were, I believe it was 22 or 24 new reactors that were planned for the US. So 2 of those were canceled as a result of Fukushima, if you want to think about it that way. But there were 2 others in Georgia where they were just breaking ground. And you can imagine people there might have reacted strongly against that more than anywhere else. But those reactors ultimately went through. And just 2 weeks ago, in fact, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gave its final operating approvals to the builders and operators. So here's one of them. It's already under construction. So of those 24 reactors, I believe the other 20 are still on the books to go up, which, given that accident, I think is pretty remarkable. And I think it really reflects how the situation was handled. So I'd like to give you one more example in some detail of a classic failure to engage the media that might be on its way to being turned around. And this is that's deep in the heart of Texas, fracking. So gas companies have been drilling fracking wells for at least a decade in Texas and Wyoming, Pennsylvania. But few people had much to say about it. And I think most people in the public didn't even really know about it. It was just kind of happening. It was industrial gas production. Until a local guy in Pennsylvania got a letter in the mail from a drilling company saying they wanted to pay him money to drill on his property. So he had some questions and they wouldn't answer them, and he asked some more questions and they basically stonewalled him on his questions. And he got a little aggravated. And unfortunately for the industry, the guy's name was Josh Fox, who happened to be a documentary filmmaker. And he made a movie about the industry's refusal to talk called Gasland, which probably a lot of you know now. And the movie made some good points and made some mistakes, but the impact of this movie was really in showing this kind of the callous attitude that the drilling companies had. towards the public and, by extension, towards the media. And that documentary kind of got the media's attention, and then the media kind of got the public's attention. So the industry still could have nipped this in the bud, but it kind of refused to talk about very kind of sticky issues that people were raising. And I ran into this firsthand because at about the same time, this was February 2010 or so, I was writing a piece for Scientific American about fracking. And when this documentary, actually when the trailers for the documentary came out, I was really at the point of kind of the height of my own reporting. So here's the article that I ended up writing. And I wanted to just tell you some of my experiences in creating this piece. So I had talked to some experts in here and there, and I was getting nowhere with the gas companies, so I ended up talking to John Hanger, who at the time was the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania, which is really where most intensely this was being done. And I started asking him questions, and he basically just bragged to me about how many drilling permits they were approving. Thousands in 2009, thousands more than 2008. Thousands beyond that were going to come up for approval in 2010. He was really proud of this. And that's all he wanted to talk about. So that didn't really help me. And it made me sort of raise a question in my own mind. He's a regulator, right? But it's sort of one of these classic situations in Pennsylvania where they're also kind of promoters of the industry as well as regulators of the industry. So I ended up having to go to independent, yeah, it's funny, we can talk about that later too. I ended up going to some independent geological scientists and hydro engineers who had actually worked in the gas industry. And one person's name is Anthony Ingraffi, who was at Cornell, who's a PhD in rock fracture mechanics, and he had actually done work, and work was supported by the gas industry. And he told me pretty much flat out about how poor cementing at the tops of the wells could allow chemicals that flow back from the water that's used to frack the rock to seep into groundwater. So what did that cause me to do? It caused me to dig deeper. And the industry still wasn't talking, which caused me to dig deeper still. So I at one point talked to a woman named Catherine Klaber, who runs this Marcellus Shale Coalition, which is kind of an industry group centered in Pennsylvania. And I asked her why the drilling companies weren't disclosing chemicals they were using. And she said, well, anybody could get this list of chemicals from the regulators. So I asked her, well, why can't I just get the list from the chemical companies? Which said, well, you can get the list from the regulators. And this wasn't just the line to me, it was to everybody, right? And the real issue there was it wasn't just a list of chemicals, it was the concentrations of the chemicals being used. And these data sheets, as they're called, didn't list the concentrations. And she knew that, and I had found that out, but she didn't want to talk about that either. So then I asked why those companies seemed to not want to discuss these issues, and they also seemed to be against what was becoming a call for tougher regulations. And she warned me when I asked that question that, and this is a quote that's in the article, she said, her response to that question was that the gas industry does not want to miss an opportunity as a country to reap the benefits that come with domestic natural gas. So basically she was telling me that people were raising concerns, and journalists like me who were asking probing questions were a threat to jobs and a threat to America. And I'm sorry to say this, but it's kind of, we run into this a lot in media when we're talking with fossil fuel industries. There's this kind of sense that if you're questioning domestic oil or natural gas or coal, you're somehow un-American. It's not said that way, but that's the implication. So all along, I had been trying to get somebody at this company called Range Resources, which is one of the big drillers in Pennsylvania, and they were really looking to get into New York, which wasn't happening yet because there was a political blockade in New York. And they wouldn't talk to me. The company's based in Fort Worth, by the way, but they're big up in the Northeast. And if you want something to look at, here's the Marcellus Shale, by the way, under Pennsylvania and New York. So I asked several different people over several different times at the company to talk, and they wouldn't. So finally, after I had talked to independent geologists like Ingraffi, Cornell, and others, I called them back and said, I just want you to know, this was late in one afternoon, we're going to go ahead and publish an article that says that fracking can potentially contaminate groundwater, and drinking water in particular. So the article can include your part of the story or not. So at 9 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang, unexpected, and it was someone named Mark Whitley from Range Resources, who was not like a PR guy. He was the senior vice president of the company. So after a few niceties, I asked a few pointed questions. He answered some. He didn't answer others. But when I asked him about whether poorly cemented wells could contaminate drinking water, all he would say is that no cases of groundwater contamination had been, due to fracking, had ever been documented. And this was, again, kind of a standard response that quickly was used by other people in the industry. So my story came out, it pointed out some troubling issues. It also pointed out, this is Scientific American, right? So it really focused even more on sort of science and scientific testing that could perhaps resolve some of these issues. For our readers, you know, the controversy was out there, but they're more interested in the science of what's going on and what science could perhaps settle or help settle. Other journalists were getting into this story now, and so they had similar experiences. When the industry wouldn't talk, they went ahead and talked to the outside experts. So the scientists, the external scientists had their say, the environmentalists had their say, the protesters had their say, but the companies in the gas industry really didn't. And they kind of got overrun by this, and demonstrations mounted in New York in particular, right? And it got so large that this sort of broad support for a moratorium in New York really took over the situation there. And then when that happens, now you've got a full-blown controversy. So now all kinds of media get involved, daily media, right? And what had been really an engineering issue became a public political issue. And so now the press was on the gas industry's case all the time. Again, sort of this day after day thing. And this got to be the story. This is what the story became, even though it really is an engineering story. And it all happened because the gas industry kind of blew it by trying to be secretive and elusive. And then when we got to this stage, anytime there was any kind of claim, you know, fracking emits lots of methane, which is going to make global warming worse. Fracking causes earthquakes. All these stories started to break, and whether they were right or wrong, the media now was kind of suspect of what the gas industry would say. And that set up a bad dynamic. And maybe you can blame the media, but the responses that the media was getting from the industry kind of forced them into that position, because that's all the industry was saying. So unfortunately, it took all this bad publicity to turn things around, but I do think that it started to turn around. So some leading executives figured out that, you know, this public opposition, media suspicion, had gotten so strong that some of their expansion plans nationwide, even far away from New York and Pennsylvania, were actually in jeopardy because of public opinion. So they did start to acknowledge some of the potential problems, and they actually raised some potential solutions, even agreeing in some cases that tougher regulation could improve practices and restore public confidence. One of the leading executives, Marvis Odom, who's the president of Shell Oil, came out and made this strong statement. And he basically said that his company would monitor its wells carefully. It would disclose the chemicals that were used in fracking fluids. He said the industry would engage with critics and would demonstrate that when well managed, fracking has benefits. He said, and this is a quote, "There's no doubt in my mind that fracking can be done the right way. The industry has completely missed the boat on not being more transparent." So that kind of engagement, that kind of statement started to turn things around. And it happened at Scientific American too. So 14 months after my story, we published a second story. This one by Chris Mooney. And it was an article that really clarified with many more specifics which very specific parts of this big fracking operation might actually pose a threat and which parts didn't. And one of the parts of the article was this illustration, which kind of summed up, again, you don't have to bother to analyze it, but kind of summed up the couple of key points that were at the crux of this whole matter. And the rest of the article was very balanced treatment of a lot of the misinformation that was out there that really was not cause for anything to worry about. And just a month ago, I did another piece on Scientific American's website about a session that was held at AAAS. It's a very big science conference. Some of you, I'm sure, know about it. 2 months ago where there was a session at the conference about fracking, and people from the industry and related to the industry basically agreed that there were 3 specific steps in this whole big complex process that might be suspect, and however, that there are ways to deal with these situations. And in fact, 2 of the presenters at that session were related to the University of Texas. So here's what I wrote coming out of that session. And the headline's a little clever, but it basically said that fracking could actually work if these 3 very specific items could be addressed, and there are ways to address them. So that's really a whole different tone than what I myself had taken about 16 months ago, right? So the lesson here is that the dynamics and it's not just companies, I'm using them because they're sort of the big examples, but that anyone who's conveying information, interacting with the media, the lessons are, as I've said, to be direct, to not have the attitude, to try to work with the media, and I'm going to get into how to do that next, right? And I think that's, again, what the nuclear industry did after Fukushima. The media wrote a few stories, and because of the posture of the industry and the regulators, I think a lot of people in the media said, well, okay, that's kind of the end of the story. I mean, we're all adults, we all know problems happen, we all know that there's ways to fix things, the industry's taking action. So journalistically, it was kind of time to move on, instead of day after day with the oil spill, day after day with fracking. So I've been making this case using kind of dramatic incidents to drive home a few basic points. Disasters are riveting, but most day-to-day journalism is not dealing with disasters. But the lessons coming out of these cases are the same. So the question for us today here is, how can the energy industry or any university or any sort of discipline engage the media in a positive way? So in the case of issues like we have been talking about, I'd suggest 3 rules for response, if you want to think of them that way. And by the way, I was talking at Michael Weber's Water and Society class yesterday, and today somehow somebody deemed as World Water Day. So I used water droplets in the background. So action number 1 is, actions speak louder than words. So address the issues by taking action on them. After the Horizon spill, BP backpedaled. After Fukushima, the industry started inspecting nuclear plants and imposing even more safety measures they could take. Number 2 is say something, however, even though actions speak louder than words. Say something, because saying something speaks louder than not saying anything, which is the position that was taken with me initially in my first story on fracking, right? Don't try to avoid the media or avoid the issues. I mean, especially today, there's just too many ways that are quick and easy to find out information. Information circulates through all kinds of electronic media now, and journalists monitor them all. So you're just really not going to cover up anything anymore unless it's highly classified kind of situation. And even then, as we've seen in the last year or 2, somehow that information can come out as well. And then the third point is just to be open. Make a case, but if you're making a case and you don't release facts, then that's not really a clever control of information. You're trying to manipulate the media, and the media has very little patience for that, and it's just going to cause them to dig deeper. So make a case with facts. So the second question then is, okay, so when there's not a disaster or controversy, how do you get the media to tell your story? So the answer comes from understanding why the media ends up running the stories it does. And this is print, on the web, radio, TV, all of it. And I just said the magic word, but you might not have noticed. The magic word is story. So journalists are looking for stories, whether they're positive or negative. They want stories, and stories have to be about something new. So that's the new in news, right? Journalists want stories, and they want stories that are new, have some new component. And I know this frustrates certain parts of the energy industry. For example, I mean, it's fair to say that the coal industry and the oil industry feel like the media doesn't want to talk about what they're doing. And I've heard it myself, and it's common to hear, hey, the media just wants to write about solar power and wind power, and they don't want to write, and maybe smart grids. They don't want to write about oil and gas. And my reply to that is, so then tell me what's new. I still get pitches about clean coal, which I got in the 1980s, and it's the same pitch. So it's just not going to lead to a story because there's nothing new to say, or maybe I'm not being convinced that there's something new to say. I get all kinds of these sort of releases and emails every day from all facets of the energy industry, and the ones I get from the fossil fuel industries tend to be saying the same thing that they have said for a long time. And the coal industry in particular kind of has this tone behind their releases, which is sort of, forget all this stuff about renewable energy. Coal's cheaper. And as a journalist, I say, right, coal's cheaper. We know that, but there's no story in that. I mean, there's nothing new. What kind of article am I going to write that says, hey, coal's cheaper? There's no story there. Meantime, the solar and wind industries are making advances, and maybe they're too expensive, but things are changing, and change means something new is occurring, and that means there's probably a story there. There's something new to talk about. There's lots of research into photovoltaics, and engineers and material scientists are coming up with compounds that capture more photons and have bigger band gaps, and these so there's technical stories. Wind prices are coming down because there's improvements in rotors and gearing and motors. So there are stories here because there's something new and there's actually a storyline. So if a coal company or a gas company, or a solar company or an energy institute at a university in Austin wants to get the attention of the media, there's a couple short points of advice that I would give. So there's really 4 questions I think that if you can answer them, raise your chances of having a story written about you and the kind of story you want written about you, right? And by the way, these 4 questions I'm going to show you kind of form the acid test at Scientific American. So we have every week we have this kind of, we have a story meeting and where we, as a group, all the editors can vet proposals. And these are basically the 4 questions we ask ourselves, whether proposals from an outsider or even one of our own people. So if you can tell me these things, the chance of your story getting told are pretty high. Right? So number 1, what's the headline? What's the one single short takeaway point of this story? We often say this, the best way to tell a story and to write a headline is to think about yourself sitting down with your grandmother at dinner. What's the one line you would tell her that you would get? So tell me that. The second one is, why now? Why is this news today versus a year ago or 20 years ago with clean coal? And why not a year from now if sometimes things are too early for a story? The third question to answer is, why does this matter to my audience? Why should they care? Is there a consumer benefit? Is there a policy implication, a social ramification? Interesting information is just that. It's not a story. And a story needs to be something that people care about if you expect them to read it. So what is it that they care about in this headline that's new now? And finally, that's kind of 4th point is kind of that again. This is a little harder. What's the storyline? It's kind of up to writers and editors to figure this out. That's part of our job, is to figure out what the storyline is. What's the narrative of the story you're going to tell? But if you can suggest some of this in your proposal, the chances go up a lot. So let me take this one step further, and then I'll end there. It's possible to interest the media in a story if you suddenly appear out of the ether like some apparition. But it's better if you kind of try to cultivate a relationship with the media. And there's a couple things that you can do to do that. Because that way the media has heard of you, maybe they've even talked to you, but they're somewhat familiar with you and your work and the place you're coming from. And it's much easier to get traction then. And I'd like to, this last slide I'd like to attribute to a woman named Jacqueline Gill, who's a PhD student in paleoecology of all things. But she's also a blogger, and she was at a recent conference. There's this kind of young conference called Science Online. And they have it every year, so the last one was in think it was January or February, Science Online 2012. It's this, in just a couple of years, this young conference has gotten to be this wildly popular meeting where social media people and scientists get together and talk about better ways for scientists to get their message out, better ways for science writers to convey information. So it's gotten to be this kind of hotbed thing, kind of like the what's the interactive part of South by Southwest? So Jacqueline was at this meeting, and she kind of did a nice job of summing up how scientists can better engage with the media. And I think the same rules apply for anybody, whether you're a scientist or a CEO or a PR person at a university. The same advice applies, right? So first of all, cultivate relationships with journalists you trust. Right? Not all reporters and writers are created equal. So keep your own list of people whose coverage you like and people whose coverage you don't like. And if you'd rather not to talk to those people, you don't have to. It's okay to say no. Just remember the lessons of the disasters that I gave you, however. Start to follow certain journalists on Twitter. You know, at the same time, get to know your company or university's PR team, your media team. They're there to help you. And get to know your local science and engineering reporters. The second one is try to understand the journalist's job, and that boils down to one thing. Journalism has to happen on deadline. So if you get a call, try to call it back quickly. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind. Don't be afraid to approach them. Many scientists and engineers think that their work is somehow not of interest to the media or the public. And others just kind of assume that if their work hasn't been recently published in a well-known journal like Science or Nature, you know, that it's not going to be of interest to journalists. But this is just not the case. So try inviting a journalist to your lab or your office. Try to invite them out to the field where you're doing work. You know, let them know about talks you may be giving or work that you've got that's kind of ongoing, published or not published. Send an idea to a magazine or newspaper writer and tell them, you know, you maybe could even write it if you feel comfortable saying that. Journalists don't always know who to talk to. They don't always know where the stories are, so help them out. And I think that's how you start to cultivate this relationship, right? You can help journalists do a good job. That's number 4, which, you know, so maybe write a press release. Or I've been talking to a lot of the communications people here the last 2 days. And I've been saying to a lot of them, you know, ask your people if they can write a blog, even if it's very occasional, even if there's just 3 entries over a year. Because what happens nowadays, if I get wind of an idea of a person, I immediately go check out their page, and most people have a page, right? But they tend to list their CVs, and that's kind of all that's there. So if there's a couple of simple blog posts, then I get more of a sense of the person, of their work, and if they can communicate well, and that all, again, helps kind of create this relationship that you can then use to your own advantage. The 5th point is provide context. So, you know, these blog posts too are kind of an excellent way for someone, journalists, to kind of see where your work fits. They can also kind of establish you as a good communicator. Put some notes up from your research or from your last field expedition. Just kind of weigh in as comfortable as you feel doing so. That'll help. And then the last point I want to make is one I want to add of my own, which is to have a positive message. Try to emphasize positive stories, solutions. I know some of you may challenge me on that in a minute when we have questions, but believe it or not, good stories do sell, as we say. And especially in science and technology, because, you know, a lot of what scientists and engineers and technologists do, what they're interested in, is understanding how things work, right? They want to see how they can advance knowledge. They want to make things better. They want to invent and innovate. These are all part of this kind of idea of progress in making the future a cooler place. So this is all a sense of positive story, right? So I think if you can follow some of these rules of engagement, if you will, and if you can stay engaged, I think that you and your industry will end up not being portrayed like this, but preferably like this. So those are my remarks, and thanks for listening.
Excellent insights. Thank you for being here. You're talking about dealing with journalists that have a lot of integrity and try to do investigative journalism in the right way. How would you recommend people in academia or industry deal with biased, lazy, top-down driven Roger Ailes, Fox News that actually put out misinformation?
Yeah, good question. I don't know if I can answer that since I'm not one of those people. No, I think, I guess part of it depends on how you approach. So I'm assuming they're calling you or even walking up to you on the street and asking you to pointing questions or to comment. Is that fair? Or blatant misinformation, right? Right. I think one tactic to take there is, like in a lot of professions, I think journalists kind of get off on catching other journalists. So if you can make some calls to some reputable people and say, hey, did you see this story? Do you realize that it's blatant misinformation? And that's going to create a story right there. So it's okay to engage, with the facts, like I said earlier, right? And I would take the offense there if it's troubling you, and call some reporters of your own and tell them that there's this story out there that needs to be told. If you're approached yourself, I think, again, you always have the option of not talking to them. So if it's someone like that you're aware of, they're going to be phishing. So I don't think you're running the risk of doing the BP thing of coming across as not talking. You're doing yourself a favor by not talking to them. So I would just say no to.
So I was kind of wondering, I'm guessing it's a question you probably get a lot, so forgive me if it's boring.
No, that's fine.
But how you think, this is maybe from hopefully a little bit of a different angle, but how you think the scientific community has dealt with, I don't know if I would call it a crisis, but what's going on around climate change and the fact that there's been so much pushback on the science behind climate change? Yeah,
and there's a lot of pushback against certain publications, including Scientific American.
Yeah.
Because I think most people in the science community have accepted this idea as proved, and so they want to move on. Again, kind of to what I was saying about, okay, so let's figure out what we can do about this. All right, enough of why, even to the point of saying, whether it's man-made or not man-made, it's happening, so let's deal with it, right? So the climate deniers are pretty politically motivated. And I think it's fairly, there are a few skeptics who raise some good concerns, but most of the so-called deniers are doing the same thing. They're really misrepresenting the facts. And for a while, there was this dynamic where the media was kind of publishing stories that were kind of rebuttals to the false information, but I think that the media's kind of gotten tired of it. And the media wants to move on too. So I think you see less of that right now. And we did a piece online that was kind of, 10 myths that the deniers were trying to promulgate. And then we did a piece in the magazine about this sort of anti-science sense that was kind of pervading the country. But we're even just not addressing that anymore either. And strangely enough, I think that's kind of an effective tactic, because they kind of had their time, and it's time to move ahead. And this is what happens in journalism. When it's time to move on, move on. So I think the deniers are really getting less coverage now. Now, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, Peter Gleich, who runs this specific institute, suddenly got called out for doing something unethical and perhaps illegal by exposing some communications from the Heartland Institute, which is sort of its basic anti-science institute. And that was really kind of hurt the cause of scientists who are trying to act ethically and trying to get beyond this. But already, if you kind of notice, that was a kind of a brief blip, and it's disappeared.
Just briefly, going back to the nuclear issues that we talked about, I just wondered if you knew the latest joke among geologists, which is, if you're trying to locate a geologic fault, sure, use all the tried and true methods, shear detectors and seismic and aerial and orbital imagery and that kind of thing. But if you really want to be sure, cite a nuclear power plant.
Right.
But I just read today that James Inhofe of Oklahoma is sponsoring a resolution through a kind of tactic that allows for a mere majority of senators, that is 51 senators, to approve a resolution that would stop EPA from regulating mercury releases and, other airborne pollutants
Right.
from power plants. And the article was framed as, here's the debate, here's the controversy. And, scientific media, like Scientific American, doesn't tend to present these debates quite in that, here's two equal sides of a story, and,
Right.
but the more localized media tend to try to do that, which furthers the problem. It lends credibility to the notion that there is actually a debate
Right.
among scientists.
Right.
Which, I kind of think that, to be a climate denier now, you have to come to the conclusion that 98.9% of all scientists worldwide are nothing more than a group of malcontents out to horsewhip faith or industry or whatever
right.
you're. So how do you, how do citizens that see the false side of setting this up as a debate? I mean, how do we, call our local stations and get them
Yeah.
to see that?
So the question is, if there's sort of an issue that's kind of been settled, and yet somehow there's some factions that kind of present it as kind of an ongoing debate when it really isn't anymore. So how do you deal with that as scientists who know the information? And this gets into this sort of sensitive area of when does a scientist decide to speak out, right? When do you? A lot of scientists will sort of still think of it as, when do you cross the line from being a scientist to being an advocate? And it's most scientists are really wary of doing that. But I think you have to decide for yourself if it's worth speaking up, and if it is, you should do it. And in terms of the media, I think it's a similar answer as before. The media sometimes knows what the story is, and sometimes knows who to talk to, but sometimes it doesn't. So I would approach, if it's the local media that's really showing this balance that isn't, I would approach them and say, hey, why don't you, and maybe not just call and say, hey, this is wrong and you should do this story. Instead, maybe invite them over, to talk about it. You're covering this, would you like to learn more about it? Why don't you come over and we can talk about it? And then have a conversation, and they get to know you, you get to know them, and I think that can lead to, again, in local media too in particular, they might not really have the right context for what they're saying, and you can help them. This is to help the journalists do their job, right? I mean, you can give them the right context where they realize, hey, we're kind of off on how we're presenting this situation. And so they may well write about that, because that's different than what they just were writing about. On a national level, in terms of sort of congressional initiatives or potential bills, some scientists have just decided they're just going to speak up. And I know it can be a risky thing to do in terms of your career. But I think, some of you may know James Hansen, right? He's kind of the guy who opened up this whole global warming in particular, issue with his studies of how much warming is going to cause havoc. And he made a conscious decision not to speak out for a long time. His data was first presented in the 80s, and it really wasn't until much later when he finally decided, in his case, that it was two things. It was personal for him because he was realizing where this was going, and he literally says, and I saw him a few weeks ago, and he says this again, that he's in his mid-60s, and he feels personally uncomfortable leaving his grandchildren, who are real people, with this kind of mess. And so that motivated him to start to speak out. And the other thing was, he had done 20 years of work, and lots of his colleagues had done 20 years of work to really nail down the data for global warming. And to see it just kind of be summarily twisted really got him angry. He's like, why did I spend my whole career, and I know this stuff is solid, I'm not just going to let this happen to my work, I think. So those two things were what motivated him to say, I'm going to speak out, and I know it's a risk, and he's gotten some flack for it. And he was arrested 3 weeks ago because he was part of a demonstration about some of this thing. But, you know, it's just kind of this, you know, civil disobedience arrest. But that's what motivated him. So I think at some point it's a personal decision of whether you want to do that.
Yeah, regarding the climate change issue, I think a lot of times the narratives that get established through a combination of politics, money, and perspectives also, because from my perspective, you see slanting of information that are driven by politics and agenda and money on all sides of on all spectrums, and they hit it from different angles. Different media outlets pick it up different ways and run different narratives. So I'm curious. I know other scientists. I work for the government who have different perspectives. I don't think there's anybody that disputes there's climate change. Anybody? It's kind of a fact. But I think it is debatable to what extent the causes behind the climate change are, and there's a lot of different data out there that support a lot of different perspectives. I don't think anybody can dispute that putting emissions into the air is bad. The question is to what extent, how bad is it, and on a relative scale, what's it doing to the climate? And so when people are in a search for the truth, you know, I think media outlets like yours provide a empirical data, you know, analytical view of all that, but most don't. And so I don't think the public gets, you know, we talked about the debate. There maybe should be a debate, and maybe people shouldn't just assume that everyone that thinks there's a different point of view and dismiss them with pejoratives about, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. Because I think it is still debatable, certain aspects of all this, but you don't see it in the media, is my point. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, it might be a good idea to have a debate, but I think on climate change in particular, I think it's become so political that, so if, let's just say the Texas Tribune was going to convene a panel of 4 people to have a debate, you know, who are they going to get and how are they going to sort of portray that even as sort of fair? It's a fair fight. And more to the point is that's not really what the media does. Maybe it should be, you know. I mean, you see these kinds of debates at conferences still. But I think for climate change in particular, most people have just kind of gotten sick of the political part of it. So the misinformation is going to continue for political motivations, whatever. I don't think you see much media coverage of that anymore. And I think that's kind of how the media is dealing with it. I think the media has made its decision too. It's going to listen to the 98.9% of people, and while there's still always going to be kind of an ear open to, you know, someone who's got something new that might turn popular opinion around, at some point, as I was saying earlier, I think the media has just decided, all right, we're going to move on, because this gets back to there's really nothing new there, so there's not a new story for us to tell, and that may just be kind of a passive answer on the part of journalism, but I think that's what's happening.